Hello and welcome to Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs, Tales of Mishaps, Misfortune, and Misadventure. I'm your host, Rich Napolitano. Today I am very pleased to have with me author Richard A. Stone, who has a new book out called Project Mayflower, Building and Sailing a 17th Century Replica. Now, this is not the usual shipwreck story that you would hear on this podcast. However, it's a really delightful story of a generous offer from the United Kingdom to create a replica in partnership with some folks over here in the United States. Richard, thank you so much for joining
Well, thank you for having me.
First of all, let's talk a little bit about how you got involved in this story. What really gained your interest?
It was a total serendipitous moment. I had done some work for the people that owned the ship. It's a museum in Plymouth, Massachusetts called Plymouth Patuxet. It's called Plimoth Plantation at the time. And they had redone the ship. So the ship is made of wood. So this is a wooden ship, not made of fiberglass like most ships nowadays. And being of wood, it suffers the ravages of time. So it had to go in for a complete reconstruction. They basically had to replicate the replica. So the ship itself was, when it was finally put back in the water, some people at Plymouth said, well, you should go to Mystic because there's someone there that you might find interesting. He can tell you something about the Mayflower II. So I drove up to Mystic, Connecticut, found a man named Warwick Charlton, and I said, so Randall, what can you tell me about the Mayflower II that I might not know? And he said, well, not much. My father's the guy that built it and gave it to America. And I said, get out of here. Your dad didn't build this. It's a gift from the British government, from the British people, like the Statue of Liberty. He said, nope. It was just my dad and some World War II veterans, and they got together to build this ship as a thank you gift to the United States, the people of the United States, for the sacrifices the nation had suffered during World War II. And I thought, wow, that's pretty amazing. I had been in the sports business, and it instantly struck me as an underdog story. I thought, here's a guy that I had never heard of. I'm assuming most people had not heard of him. And it's like the person that catches the winning touchdown in the championship game. Everybody cheers the quarterback, and no one ever hears of the man that made it possible. So anyway, that got me looking into it. And as I delved further, I discovered quite an interesting story.
And it is an interesting story. And I appreciate that it comes from a sense of appreciation and generosity from the folks over in the UK. Now, the story there goes a little deeper, obviously. What really inspired the token of appreciation to begin with?
So the man behind it, a fellow named Warwick Charlton, he was a soldier during World War II. He was a pressman, and he was on the staff of General Bernard Montgomery, Monty, who was perhaps the most famous British general in World War II in Europe. And he was with him in North Africa during the siege of Tobruk and then subsequently the battles of El Alamein. And during that period, the Germans, they were opposite Rommel, the Desert Fox, and they were beating them because they had better equipment. The U.S. then entered the scene. This is before we got into the war formally by sending Sherman tanks to the British Eighth Army, and that changed the war. And they were able to then push Rommel back, stop his effort to seize the oil fields of Arabia, and then subsequent to that, he was transferred to Asia, where he worked on the personal staff of Lord Louis Mountbatten, perhaps the most famous naval man in World War II, Prince Philip's uncle. Queen Elizabeth II used to like calling him Uncle Dickie. And because of his proximity to those men, he thought, wow, the U.S. really, we should thank them. And then he got back to Europe. What has Britain ever done? We've given them a couple of briar pipes, a tweed coat. I mean, look at the French. They give them the Statue of Liberty. We should do something, but what can you do for the richest country on earth? This was the richest country. The U.S. can buy everything. What do you give someone that has everything? And as he thought about it, he thought, what I can do is give them a piece of their lost history. I'm going to rebuild the Mayflower, the ship that brought those Pilgrims in 1620, inspired Thanksgiving, and was then lost to the scrapyard, because after they dropped off the Pilgrims, it went back, and a couple years later, it was declared in ruins and sold for scrap. He said, I'm going to rebuild that ship. And I'm going to rebuild it exactly as it would have been built in 1600s. I'm going to use old materials, no modern tools, and then I'm going to get a crew. I'll find them somewhere, and we're going to sail it across the Atlantic. So that was his dream, and he had this idea of this grand adventure. That was his point of view. So he's now on the British side. Because he didn't know much about sailing, he declared himself, I didn't know anything about the sea, the sailing, or anything, but he had a great tutor. So he found a man named Dr. Roger Charles Anderson of the Greenwich Museum in London. And Anderson was reading articles as he was tutoring Warwick, and he found a story, a couple articles, about a group in Massachusetts that was also developing a replica. And it sounded like what Warwick wanted to do. And they thus sent a letter of introduction. Charlton then met up and joined forces with Harry Hornblower. Harry Hornblower was the son of a financial man. They owned an investment house. And from his earliest childhood, he had seen groups like the Rockefellers doing Williamsburg and the Fords, Greenfield Village out in Michigan. And he thought, I should really do something like that. I would like to start a museum that will really introduce a new way of teaching American history. When people walk through its gates, they're going to step back in time, and I'm going to have costume docents who will speak as they would have in 1620, and it'll be a different experience. As he did that, he realized that the story of those pilgrims was made possible by a ship, the Mayflower, and thus he had an idea to also build it. So he had an Englishman and American, both with the desire to build this 17th century ship simultaneously, and then they joined forces, and that's really where the story begins.
I think it's quite ironic that the gentleman's name was Hornblower. It just seems perfectly suited since the famous TV series and books, Horatio Hornblower. I'm sure that wasn't lost on you either.
Well, it actually wasn't lost on the crowd, so you're exactly right. So Horatio Hornblower, C.F. Foster, has this famous character. When the ship was launched in Devon, England, Hornblower couldn't get over, but he sent a note, saying, good luck with it. And when his name was announced to the crowd, they all broke into laughter, saying, wow, even this mystical guy is coming out, but it was not Horatio, it was Harry. It was quite remarkable.
The initial plans for the Living Museum at Plymouth included originally, I believe from your book, you said that he wanted to build a ship, but then realized that it wasn't going to be possible because of the depth of the channel.
That's right. So this was, again, there's a lot of serendipity and just good fortune that goes in with this. So Hornblower and his team of executives, they initially wanted to build a ship that would float. So they would have it anchored in Plymouth Bay. Plymouth Bay is Cape Cod. So if you think of Cape Cod Peninsula, Plymouth is at the beginning of it, and then Cape Cod hooks around like a finger. And the bay is Cape Cod, and Plymouth is on one side of that. So they were going to anchor a ship in Plymouth, but there was issues about public safety, and there had been some hurricanes, so that was scrapped, at which point they decided to build what they called a waterline model, which would be a frame of a ship on a concrete slab, and it would be very similar to what Walt Disney had done at exactly the same time with the Captain Hook pirate ship and the Chicken of the Sea restaurant out in Disneyland in Anaheim, California. That was the plan. So we're just going to build a stationary water-based model, and that'll work. Nonetheless, they hired this famous architect. The architect develops this incredible plan, these designs, which in itself is pretty amazing because there weren't any plans from the 17th century. People would make a ship, but they wouldn't necessarily keep track of what the architectural design was. So he had to work backwards to figure out what it might look like, its shape, size, and all of that. And he had nothing to go on other than a description of its weight. So when the Pilgrims came over, a book was written about that, called Of Plimoth Plantation, and ergo the name of the museum. And in the book, they don't even call the ship the Mayflower. They just said, we came over on a ship. It was 180 tons of burden, and it had at least one topsail. That's all that William Baker, the architect, had to go on. And then working backwards, he was able to discover records dating back to Elizabethan times, which he was able to then redesign, come up with this plan. He then presents it to the people at Plymouth. They spent $2,400 for these designs, which was a lot of money at the time. And he figured, it'll just kind of sit in a museum archive. Great plans, but they're not going to go anywhere. And it was pure chance, fate, that Charlton called at exactly the moment that he was delivering those plans to the Hornblower team. And they thought, wow, this is something. There was an issue that Hornblower didn't want to spend the money to build the ship. He thought, where am I going to get the financing? And all I need is something that will be an artifact to support my museum. Charlton, on the other hand, thought, I don't care what this costs. I will organize this. I will somehow find the money because we're going to build this ship because we need to thank America for its sacrifices. And thus he began his undertaking. Because at that time, this is now the mid 1950s, President Eisenhower is finishing up his first term, and he was a great believer in a principle of what they called soft power and cultural diplomacy. Ike had seen war. He was the general that guided us in the United Forces of Europe against the Nazis. And so he was a great proponent of soft power. And we should really find ways to do some cultural diplomacy, find common points of interest that connect our two nations, England and the United States. And just shortly before all he was thinking about that, certainly Winston Churchill was thinking of it. And when the war ended a year afterwards, he gave a very famous speech in Missouri, which he used two words that became central to the Cold War era. One of them was the Iron Curtain, and the other one is special relationship. So in 1946, while Warwick is still in uniform, Churchill's giving this speech out in Missouri, and he says, the world is experiencing something very bad. The communists have dropped an iron curtain across Europe, but there is a counterweight to that, a special relationship between the United Kingdom and the United States, and that will defend democracy. And driven by his desire to thank America for its sacrifices, and then given kind of a framework of a special relationship, that Charlton moved forward. I'll describe a little bit of a hiccup that he had with this too, because the British government also wanted to move forward with this. So they like this idea of special relationship. We're going to find a bond between our two countries. But they had a different approach. Charlton is just a commoner who happened to be a veteran and a journalist. But the Foreign Office, what we need is a connection between our upper class and the Americans' upper class. Those aristocratic families in New England and along the coast, and they'll match up with us. When Charlton started looking for funding, he went to those very groups to see if they might be interested in supporting his effort to build a second Mayflower. When the Foreign Office found out about it, they did not like it, and they saw him as a competitor. Thus, they contacted people like the English-speaking Union, the Pilgrims Society, and said, these people, Charlton and his associate, they're really not the right sort, and I think you should stand clear of them. So there was just a sense of competition between the Foreign Office and Warwick Charlton. Nonetheless, just regular people in England got wind of this construction going on in Brixham. So Brixham is in southern England, in Devon, and it was the largest wooden shipbuilding project of the century. And it sparked the British imagination. So people started flocking to Brixham the way they used to go to Paris to look at the Statue of Liberty before it was disassembled and brought over here. So public support became up, and he was able to get some funding, and they were thus able to move forward despite the Foreign Office's efforts to interfere with his efforts. That was an unexpected speed bump.
And am I correct that even the United States government had some issues with this effort, that they also saw it as some kind of competition?
Well, they just thought it was a publicity stunt. They're thinking they have Walt Disney. He's built a Chicken of the Sea thing on Disneyland. They know about that. And here's a guy in England claims he wants to build a Mayflower II. They don't have much need for it. They kind of see him as as somewhat of a huckster, a promoter. They were not particularly interested. They had shared a feeling with the British Foreign Office about this effort by Warwick Charlton to build a ship.
So at first the fundraising was difficult, but eventually that was overcome. What kind of people were hired to build a ship, especially one that was built 300 years prior in a style that nobody's really familiar with?
Right. So this all required, in a sense, what you might call men born out of their time. So from the shipbuilding side, they found a man named Stuart Upham's shipyard in Brixham, and they had been building wooden ships for 300 years. And during World War II, they built a lot of wooden minesweepers for the British Admiralty. So Upham was known to the Brits, and he knew how to build wooden ships. That was one thing. It's one thing building a ship. Who in the world is going to sail it? By chance, shortly before all of this began, there was a great movie of Moby Dick, starring Gregory Peck and Orson Welles, that was shot in John Houston in the North Sea. And the captain of the ship during the shooting happened to be an Australian captain, sea captain named Alan Villiers. And Alan Villiers organized a crew so John Huston could have dramatic scenes really set at sea to tell the Moby Dick story. So when the word got out about Warwick's plan, there was some press about it. So the people in Brixham, Upham, just happened to call him saying, I read about your desire to build a wooden ship. Could I do it for you? And thus they started using Upham. News of that then was told in the U.S. by the U.S. press, the New York Times, the Boston Globe, everybody, they're starting to talk about this. And one of the people that heard about it was the editor of National Geographic, a man named Mel Grosvenor. And as he's reading these articles, he's thinking of a man who's provided a lot of great stories for them, Alan Villiers. So Alan Villiers is a very prolific writer, in addition to being a great sea captain. And he had written like 20 books about the high seas and tall ships in the years leading up to this moment. So Grosvenor sends a note to Alan Villiers in England and says, Alan, you probably have seen in the paper, they're organizing a group to build a Mayflower and sail it across. I think it'd be a good story for the National Geographic. Why don't you go down and check it out? So Alan goes down to Brixham, meets up with Warwick, and he sends a note back to Grosvenor. He said, you're not going to believe this. They want me to be the captain of the ship. So you had this instant, this again, serendipity that National Geographic wants to write a story about Mayflower II. They send their best writer, Alan Villiers, who then gets hired to captain the ship. So he's now soon going to be holding a pen in one hand and the ship's wheel in the other. And luckily, he had stayed in touch with the men, the crew, who had worked with him on the Moby Dick project. John Huston, North Sea, you can still see it on American Movie Classics or something. And so he called those men back. So he had a core team of tall ship veterans who could sail it. And then after that, so that was the key, his mates, his first, second, and third mate as bosun. And thus the other men that became the crew, and there were a total of 33 people on this ship, plus a cat. They had a cat named Felix. But these older, experienced men taught the younger guys how to sail. And because of that, they were able to successfully navigate from England, Plymouth, to Plymouth, USA.
Yeah. And you mentioned earlier about how they were essentially going to have to reverse engineer the design of the Mayflower from whatever records they could find. How did that process get started, and what challenges did they face as the ship progressed from keel to being completed?
Very good question. First of all, where do you find the plans? So again, he reversed engineered looking at the weight. So how do you determine weight? There was a formula in the Queen's Admiralty Department that described basically a form of the Archimedes principle. This has to do with, displacement of water. So using 180 tons of burden, he could go backwards because their design said, well, if your keel is X and the hull breadth is Y, you can kind of figure out what it might be. And that's how he was able to put it together, the plans for it. Once you do get the plans, then the issue is where in the world do you get the wood? Because the people in the U.S., when Charlton sent his associate over there, the Plymouth folks thought it would take about 2 years to come up with enough live oak to build this ship. Luckily for Brixham, they were near a very famous source of wood called Wistman's Wood in Dartmoor, the moors of Dartmoor. And in fact, it was so famous that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle in The Hound of the Baskerville sets that in Devon. So he would go out, and that's where he found tons and tons of live oak. So live oak is a very strong wood, but it grows in every direction except straight. So it's crooked and bent and looks horrible, perfect for a ship like this, because there was nothing straight in the ship. When he got to the masts, where do you find the masts? He went to Canada. So he then, once the ship was in the water, he goes to Canada, finds tall Oregon pines. And they could be have a diameter of 4 feet or more. And that's the source of the masts and the spars. But the oak came from the moors of Dartmoor and Devon. And then they had to cut these by hand. The challenge then was, for Warwick, he said, well, if we're doing this the way they did back then, where are the saws? Where are the axes? So they had to go back and find these old tools and old guys, they were in their 80s, who could teach younger people how to use them. And thus they built this without any modern devices, which is pretty amazing when you think of that alone. But that's how they constructed the ship and found the wood and then put it together to create the...
I thought it was really interesting in your book when you're describing this process and using techniques and tools that they had in the 1600s, that everything from, like you said, the keel and the masts and the spars to even the galley, they tried to make everything as unique or as authentic as possible.
Right.
And designing the rigging, that was interesting too, of how a scale model was designed and the optimal rigging was determined kind of by fussing around with this model.
With the model, so the rigging are the ropes for people. Your audience knows this, but there's running rigging and standing rigging. So standing rigging is what you wrap around the mast to keep the mast in place. The running rigging goes through dead eyes and it holds the ship together. But putting that in the right order within the ship so the lines don't interfere with each other. Just imagine, when you pull a cord out of when you get ready for Christmas lights in a month and they're all twisted together, rigging's the same way. So you have to put it so each one is separate. To do that, Stuart Upham, the owner of the shipyard, went to a place called an abbey near the Brixham, where there was a model of the Golden Hind. So the Golden Hind was the ship used to circumnavigate the world. Anyway, he rigged his little ship. He had a model. He rigged that with a wire, and then he used a little bigger cord, and then he used a wider cord and put in little dead eyes. But he rigged a model. So imagine if you're at home and you're rigging the model of a ship, you're making a little ship. That's what they used for as the design to connect miles of rigging with the masts and the arms. In terms of life on the ship, so it's hard for us to imagine. And when they had this over, this ship was exactly as it was in 1620, which meant there was no electricity, no refrigeration, no running water. The head was the head. It's a hole at the front of the ship, and you go up and you do your business, and hopefully a big wave didn't come and splash on you. But it was a very crude ship. So people have asked me, so how big was it? What are we talking about here? And I said, well, imagine the COVID. We all remember that. So just say you're suddenly confined to a large dining room or a meeting room that might be 100 by 25 feet. That's the full length of the deck of the ship. So you now have a large conference room, and you have 140 people in the conference room for 66 days. You can't get out, you can't bathe, there's no running water, pretty miserable. And that was life there. They were stuck there for 66 days. That alone is amazing. And as the crew went over, there were only 33 men on this ship. And they just couldn't quite imagine what it must have been like 400 years earlier for those original Pilgrims. But they were driven by two really core drivers for all of us. One happens to be faith in something. Half of them were very religious and wanted to see if they could set up a place where they could worship as they wanted to without the government interfering. And the other half of the people were just business guys thinking, this is the land of opportunity. I want to go there and make a start. It's supposed to be great in the New World. I want to get there. And so you had these two very different groups of people. Let's say they're split roughly 50-50. So you got half the group in this large conference room that you're stuck in for 66 days with no running water and no electricity, and you're kind of smelly and kind of whatever, but you now finally get to the promised land. You make landfall, and they were at each other's throats by this time. They were pushing and shoving it. They really wanted to, who knows, just get off this ship. But they didn't leave so fast. And what they did say is, look, when we get off this ship, when we get off of the Mayflower and we step ashore for the first time, we could scatter. Hopefully we won't, but we might scatter. So let's now agree to disagree before we get off. And thus they wrote an agreement. They said, let's make a body politic. We're going to call the people in this room, we're going to call us a body of people, we're going to call it a body politic. And once we agree to disagree, we do know that we want one thing in common. And that is we'd all like to have kind of just and equal laws for our general good. And they write that down. Now, when they did write it down, what was kind of interesting, they were fleeing and doing this in opposition to at the time, not initially planning to, but now they realized they were beyond the king's reach. And that king, King James, had told people that if you disagree with me, it's sedition. So, you're going to risk your life and limb by writing your name on that document. Anyway, the document becomes known as the Mayflower Compact. It in turn becomes the prequel for what we know 150 years later as the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution, where they're willing to sacrifice their life and liberty for those principles. So as you think about this story and the people on this ship, what they went through, the decision to agree to disagree, it's really the prequel to Ken Burns' The American Revolution. It began here. Warwick didn't know quite that when he was starting it. But he wanted to build that ship because he thought it was a piece of America's lost history and it knew it was important to the Americans.
Yeah. And as Americans, we learn this story from the time we're young children about the Pilgrims coming over on the Mayflower and setting up the Plymouth colony and leading to what we call the first Thanksgiving. And then later the celebration of that first Thanksgiving as a national holiday. But I have a lot of listeners from other parts of the world that probably don't know this story or unfamiliar with the Mayflower. Although it was more or less an unremarkable ship itself, it has a great significance to American history, just as a symbol.
You are correct. And so friends of mine would say, why in the world do you remember this ship? Literally, there were tens of thousands of ships that came over in those years from Europe, particularly from England, but elsewhere, that came here. Why in the world did they remember this ship? There was Jamestown. Jamestown was before this. That was England's first big colony in the New World. But they remembered it because its passengers got blown off course, happened to write down on a piece of parchment what they wanted. That's the only reason that it's remembered. They just happened to write that down. And then subsequently, when they survived that first year, so they make it, the Wampanoag, the Native Americans that were here, helped them. So they worked together in unison, and so they land in November. A year later, the harvest is there, and they're thinking, wow, we should thank each other for what we've done. And they have a great celebration. And the Indian chiefs come, the colonists are there. All of that is described by a guy, Bradford, the same guy that wrote of Plimoth Plantation, and he describes it to people back in England. And he does it for two reasons. One is he wants to tell them how wonderful it was that we've worked in unity for a common purpose. And that's also as a sales pitch, because the government wants people to know how great it is in the New World, because we were still the New World. But that's why they remembered this particular ship, because people wrote those words down. None of those words appear in America's constitutional documents, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, but the aspirational goal of what they sought was the driving force. And one of the passengers, a woman named Priscilla Mullins, she had a couple of kids, had a lot of kids, but their grandkids and great-grandkids became John Adams and John Quincy Adams. And of course, we know they went on to be presidents of the United States. So there's a lot of connection between this group and the signers of the Declaration of Independence and our nation's core history, the values that got us going.
It's good timing, this episode, because it will come out the week of Thanksgiving, 2025. So this is a good time to be talking about this story. Once the ship is completed, there's a lot of excitement, and people are, like you said, coming to Brixham and seeing the ship. What was the plan as far as what course they would take, and when were they going to leave?
Villiers' original plan, because he wanted to be historically accurate, was to sail across basically 40 degrees north, which is the North Atlantic, kind of a straight line. However, the British maritime authorities were warning of rough weather and possibly ice at sea, because following the Titanic, they would keep track of icebergs and things like that. So 5 days out from Plymouth, he decided to take a different route. He took the path of Columbus to avoid that watery thing. And it extended the voyage by 2,000 miles. If he had gone straight, 40 degrees, it'd be about 3,500 miles. The route he ended up taking was about 5,500. And that route goes south. It goes through the Canary Islands, you go off the coast of Africa, and then you catch the trade winds at about 20 degrees north. That then blows you west. So then take that across. The trade winds are carrying them over. You get to Bermuda, the Sargasso Sea. You turn right, you go north, and then they went north. They go a little west of Bermuda, and they go on to Massachusetts. And we all know that you hear tales of sailing in that part of the ocean. The waters get very warm. And it can be very treacherous and can change overnight. So while the bulk of the voyage, the The original voyage took 66 days, which was 3,500 miles, 66 days. This is 2,000 miles longer, and they did it in 55 days because the winds were with them. But when they got to Bermuda, they ran into incredibly bad weather. Bad weather being a gale force 8 in the Beaufort scale, 50, 60 mile an hour gales. And Villiers, in that dramatic moment, as they're going forward, he's thinking, wow, what am I going to do? And what do those other ships do? Well, what the ships back then did, and what he did, was they called lie a hull. So some people say when you lie a hull, it's what you do when sailing becomes a matter of survival. You pull up the sails, you cinch them down, you batten the hatches, you hold the wheel hard to the right, to starboard, you lash it down, and you let the wind blow you wherever it might. So that's what they did, and they luckily were able to survive that storm, which is pretty remarkable because when Charlton began, and the architect Baker commented on this, he said, when he started, people were saying, you'll never find the plans. But he did find them. Then they said, well, you found the plans, but you'll never find a shipyard that can build that kind of a ship. But he did. And they said, well, you got the plans, you got the build, but you'll never find a crew. He did find the crew, pretty remarkably. Thank you, John Huston, and the Pequod adventure. And then it weathered this gigantic storm, which really, to the extent that anyone might have doubted the seaworthiness of this replica versus the original, it survived it and came through with really with flying colors, given all they could. It went 38 degrees, over nearly. And Seward Upham was not a ratliner. Somebody would climb the mast, but Stewart Upham was on the ship during the voyage, and he knew what 38 degrees is. In a few more degrees, he'd be tumbling to the bottom of the ocean's floor. But they made it. And there's some certainly dramatic scenes in the book and the story, getting those sails in, and then they arrived. But it was just a remarkable voyage.
Yeah, I don't recall now. I know on the ship they had a radio and some other safety equipment. Was there any other ships trailing them or keeping an eye on them, or they were just on their own?
They're on their own. Although so they're on their own. Sometimes they wouldn't see people for days. They wouldn't see a ship for days. They would just be by themselves, and it's truly a dot. If you consider the ship's 100 feet long, 25 feet wide, that's a cork in the sea. And no, they were by themselves with it. They had a radio because the maritime authorities in Britain mandated they had to carry a radio, so they had that for emergency purposes. They had life rafts, which again they were mandated to carry, but that was it. A radio and a couple life rafts. Good luck. So when they hit that storm, the Coast Guard sent out planes to look for them because they were blown about 60 miles off course, but no one was blown overboard, so that was good. But they were on their own.
So 55 days, they make it across, and what kind of reception do they receive in Plymouth?
Fabulous. People are so glad to see them. There's a great...
It must have been quite a sight.
It was quite a sight, but what's funny is, so during the writing of this, in addition to meeting Randall with Warwick Charlton's son, I also got to know Hatsie Hornblower. Hatsie is Harry Hornblower's daughter. So at one point, Hatsie said, well, my dad said there was a mutiny on the ship. Do you know anything about a mutiny? What's that about? I said, well, there wasn't a mutiny. However, after that storm, so they get to this tremendous storm off of Bermuda, gale force 8, 38-degree rolls, they make it, and then they're suddenly becalmed. There's like, the wind dies. They're just sitting there. Nothing happens. And out of the blue pops a periscope, looks around, has its eyepiece turned to the ship, and before they know it, an entire submarine comes up. And the captain says, you want a tow? And Villiers goes, yeah. And the crew said, no. So anyway, there was a moment there where he had the gear pulled out, and it was, he was thinking, let's have a tow. The men said no. By good fortune, the Coast Guard flew over and dropped over a few, dozen cans of beer, so the guys could have a drink while they're waiting for the captain to decide. But it was only the captain's choice on what would be done unless the gods somehow intervened, and they did. So the next morning, after it being becalmed and fighting off that periscoped submarine, the wind came up, and they were able to get moving. And again, just serendipitously, the Queen herself shows up in the form of the Queen Elizabeth ocean liner. And in the opposite direction comes the U.S.'s most magnificent tall ship, the Eagle, on its annual training cruise. So you got the Queen on one side, the Eagle on the other. The Eagle's captain, Carl Zittel, who used to sail with Villiers, sails over. he shouts out the mariner's classic, "What ship?" And Villiers shouts back, "The Mayflower, 350 years out of London." And it was fabulous. Anyway, they then he gave them directions to Nantucket. They made it. And then when they arrived, it was a huge celebration in Plymouth. So it was dramatic, and the people just went nuts. And of course, when they walked ashore, the first person that greets them says, "Welcome to America." So they made it. What's on the cover of the book, when I first saw the image on the cover, which shows that ship going into New York Harbor, I thought it was a fake. I thought it was a Photoshop. It turns out it wasn't. It isn't. It was taken by National Geographic's most renowned photographer of the era, a fellow named B. Anthony Stewart. Anyway, it goes into New York, tremendous ceremony. One of the people that loved this story and loved sailing was Jack Kennedy. So when the ship was in Plymouth, after it landed, he was on a campaign tour, getting an early start on the presidential run, and he was in Plymouth speaking to the Massachusetts Bar Association or something. But before leaving town, he went over to the Mayflower. And there's images of him on the ship, holding the wheel, kind of guiding it, maybe the ship of state for the future. He liked it so much that a few days later, the ship appears now in New York Harbor on July 1st, 1957. July 4th, 1957, future President John F. Kennedy read the full text of the Declaration of Independence on WQXR radio. And you can still find that. It's incredibly stirring. So his connection to that ship, the ship going into New York Harbor, a lot of people think that the tall ships that eventually became Operation Sail began with this entrance. And of course, Kennedy was a great proponent of Operation Sail. They had met with him, in the early part of 1963, but he was assassinated before the first Op Sail could happen. But it was carried on in his name, and I like to think that part of its pedigree is this ship that's shown on the front of my book and that National Geographic took a great picture of and described at the moment as the photo of the century, because even to this day, it looks like a Photoshop. I just can't quite believe it's really there, but it really was.
Yeah, it makes it even more awe-inspiring that there's a U.S. Army blimp in the photo.
Well, the blimp is there. I don't want to give too much away about the story, but when they built the ship, Warwick's goal was to give this as a thank you gift for America. The Foreign Office didn't like what he was doing. They wanted to do something else. Nonetheless, he's able to get it in the water, and it's launched in September 1956. And at that moment, he and Stuart Upham and Alan Villiers are thinking, well, despite all the troubles we've had, that the ship's going to make it. It's going to be really good, and it's going to celebrate this special relationship. Well, a month later, the special relationship went into the toilet. Britain, in cahoots with France and Israel, started a war in the Middle East that became known as the Suez Crisis. It was in the middle of Eisenhower's campaigning. He was running as a peace candidate. Anyway, Brits start a war in the Middle East. Watching that happen, is Russia. So Russia's thinking, if Britain and France, if they're going to start a war in the Middle East, I'm going to go attack the guy next to me because I kind of like his territory. So the Soviet Union attacks Ukraine's neighbor, Hungary, and viciously crushes the Hungarian Revolution a month after Suez. So you have the ship in the water in September. The next month you have Suez. The month after that, you have Russia invading its neighbor. But a meeting was held in Bermuda in March, and the U.S. and Britain are trying to get let the world know that they're friendly again. I mean, how in the world can you tell the world that we're friends beyond what they've been trying to do? And it occurs to them that a symbol of unity would perhaps be the best way to tell the Russians and everybody else that the United States and Great Britain stand as one. And that thing was the ship. So the Mayflower II suddenly went from a token of past sacrifice to a diplomatic ambassador uniting the United States and the UK at a moment when it needed it the most. And this story captivated the world's attention as the conquering of Mount Everest did a few years earlier. It was the story of 1957, and it described unity between the two countries. And following that conference in Bermuda, Eisenhower, that's why he had the blimp there. They said, something, I guess this isn't such a publicity stunt. And the British Foreign Office said, for all this guy being not a diplomat, he certainly did something pretty remarkable. and thus the blimp is there, and it's, I guess they say the rest is history. But it's a pretty amazing story that's relevant today. Again, particularly if you consider the document that was signed in the main cabin of that ship, which is sitting up in Plymouth. That's where they think they signed to that Mayflower Compact, and the great-great-great-grandchildren of the people that signed that document were then involved with the Declaration of Independence 150 years later. So there's a great connection between this story, America's 250th anniversary, that makes it very relevant, in part because it's going to be sailing in a year. So next summer, tall ships are coming back. The people in New York tried their darndest to get the ship to come back to New York to relive that entrance, which is fabulous. The ship is not going to be able to get to New York, but it will be in Boston Harbor. So for people that are in Boston next summer in July, the Mayflower II will be sailing in that harbor along with other tall ships, the USS Eagle, Coast Guard Eagle, and other ships. It'll be a sight to be seen.
How does Hornblower put the Mayflower II into use at Plimoth Plantation as part of his overall vision of the museum that he's building?
So it becomes central to the museum. It's central to the museum to this day. So that, again, you have this ship of immigrants, the Mayflower, lands, and once they land on Plymouth Rock, they start a colony, and that colony is called the Plymouth Plantation. And so the two go hand in gloves. The ship is there today, docked at the harbor side, and the plantation is located, the museum, where the Pilgrims originally were, which is by the Eel River, about 5 miles from town. Just by coincidence, it's exactly on the spot where the people were 400 years ago. It's pretty amazing, but they go together, and it's a story. It's an origin story. So as America considers who we are and where we come from, a big part of that origin story connects back to this ship.
And that Plymouth Plantation, that museum now, I believe it's been renamed to Plymouth Patuxent. Is that correct?
Correct. So it's named Plymouth Patuxent. They renamed it in 2020, 5 years ago, following it was the 400th anniversary of the sailing, and the United States government, the Department of the Interior, honored the ship by declaring it a National Historic Site, saying that it had made a great contribution to the nation, to educating people about our past. And also in recognition of that, the museum changed its name to the original location's name, which was Patuxent. So instead of being Plymouth Plantation, it's Plymouth Patuxent Museums, what it's now called.
And that's open to the public to visit, and people can tour the ship, I believe, still.
It's a great family vacation. So where is it and how do you get there? Certainly this time of the year, a lot of people are thinking about Thanksgiving, but any time of the year, particularly in the spring and summer, it's open. It's always open to the public. So Plymouth, an hour south of Boston. The ship itself is at the harbor side, and then the museum, the buildings, and one of the Hornblower centers where you enter is about 5 miles out of town. And you'll find costume docents telling the history. You'll find people on the ship telling the history. And when you get off the ship, there's a lot going on because 100 yards from that is Plymouth Rock. So you think about Plymouth Rock and the jokes and songs that have been written about it. There really is a Plymouth Rock, and it's near the ship. And just up the street from that is the oldest museum in the country called Pilgrim Hall. There's lots to do, great dining, great beaches. So you think of all the people that go to Cape Cod, they're right there. So if you're driving to Cape Cod, you owe it to yourself to go by and see the Mayflower, which is in fact seen by a lot of people annually. So since it arrived, I think more than 25 million people have actually gone on board it. It's one of the top tourist attractions of Massachusetts and New England.
And I was reading about this too, that underwent some repairs and some maintenance over some recent years, including at the Mystic Seaport Restoration Shipyard.
That's correct. So in the mid-teens, it was discovered that the wood, because it is a wooden ship, the maintenance discovered some wood rot. So it was determined that it needed a major renovation. They really needed to replicate the replica. And of that, 70% of the wood was replaced. The original keel is still there, but 70% of the framing, ship, the whole thing was redone. So one of the interesting stories is, where in the world do you find those live oaks today? And they came from various parts of the United States. They came from a Royal Danish forest where they sent over live oak to be done. The masts, they redid the yard arms, they redid, but the main mast, instead of being a Oregon pine single tree, it is now a laminated Douglas fir spire. It's Douglas fir laminated. They expect it'll last longer. But beyond that, everything on it is pretty much as originally done, with two notable exceptions. One are the sails. So the sails in 1957 were made with flax canvas. So flax is a fiber, it's thinner than a human hair, and it has been used to make wind catchers since the great tea clipper days, where people were to go sailing from London to Bombay and Calcutta to get tea. That was the sail. Years later, when they were doing the renovation, flax became very difficult and expensive to find, and it was also heavy. So they came up with a new substance. It was, kind of had the strength of polyester, the feel of cotton, and that became it became known as Oceanus, made by North Sails of New England, and those are the sails that are on the ship. Similarly, when they did the renovation back in the day, centuries ago, they would use hemp, and hemp was the material used to make the rigging, standing and running. 50 years later, very difficult to find hemp. And so they used a new thing called Dyneema, which is a special cordage that has many times the strength of steel, lighter weight than hemp. So they changed things with stronger, lighter weight materials, stronger, lighter weight sails, stronger, lighter weight rigging. And then to counter that, because if it gets too light above, to get tippy, they redid the ballast in the ship. So it originally had 130 tons of old rail irons and steel and cement. They took that out and they replaced it with a well-ventilated lead at the bottom. So the ship looks great. It looks fabulous, truly. But it's little. When people go to see it, they go, "Wow, is that it? How'd all those people fit on that deck?" It's a wonderful little ship.
Well, the book is called Project Mayflower, Building and Sailing a 17th Century Replica by Richard A. Stone. And where can everybody find your book?
It's available wherever books are sold. So a quick plug for the book. It was published by Lyons Press, a division of Globe Pequot. It's distributed by Simon & Schuster. It's in hard copy and ebook. An audio edition will be out by the end of the year. And the book not only has gotten good reviews here, in England at the Imperial War Museum, home of the Churchill Libraries, they cite the work for its contributions to understanding the Suez Crisis and what was going on. And if you go to the London's Greenwich Museum, the Caird Library, you'll find a copy of the book. So people seem to have liked it, and hopefully your readers will like it if they get it. And if they don't want to read it, they can wait a month and listen to it.
Yeah. Well, I liked it. I liked it tremendously. It's a delightful book about a very significant story and a wonderful gesture from the United Kingdom to make to the United States. And of course, there's a lot more detail in the book, especially about the building of it, the international tensions at the point of the war that broke out, the voyage across the sea, a lot more about the people involved. So I highly recommend it. And Richard, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to talk to me today.
Well, thank you for letting me join you. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving.
You as well.